Hi, welcome to our daily encounter. A lot has happened since our last devotion. We talked about Mephibosheth, but we didn't talk much about uh, David and Bathsheba and that whole incident. And that was a story in which David uh, stayed behind while his men were out fighting the battles, and he saw Bathsheba taking a bath, and he calls for her, and he ends up sleeping with her, and she conceives of a child. And so he calls Uriah back from the battlefield, hoping that he would sleep with his wife and therefore think that the child was his. But Uriah doesn't do it. And so David ends up having Uriah killed in battle. And Nathan points this out to David and basically tells David that God had spared his life, but that the sword would not depart from his house. And in our reading today, we're seeing the fruits of that take place. Absalom, David's son, has now rebelled against him, and to the point that David and all the people connected to him have to actually flee Jerusalem. And there's this real sad section here in connection to that when they pass over the valley Kidron, or the Kidron Valley. In verse 23 of chapter 15, it says, "The whole countryside wept aloud as all the people passed by. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, and all the people moved on toward the desert." And then as you go down to verse 30, it says, "But David continued up to the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered, and he was barefoot. And all the people with him covered their heads too, and were weeping as they went up." All right, so it's a really sad story. The Kidron Valley was east of Jerusalem, and it was in between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. And so to get to the Mount of Olives, you'd pass the Kidron Valley. And David sends the people ahead, and then he passes over the Kidron Valley. And then as he's going up to Mount Olive, he's weeping. The whole countryside was weeping when they saw this procession going through here. Just a really, really sad time in David's in the time of David. David went from being a very powerful king, a very influential king, one that was respected, to now being driven out of his own city by his own son. And what is really interesting about this whole story is just how closely it reflects what would happen with Jesus. In John chapter 18 and verse 1, we see Jesus also passing through the Kidron Valley, again to go up to the Mount of Olives. And this is the night that he was betrayed. If you remember, he passed through the Kidron Valley, and in verse 2 of chapter 18, it goes right into the story of Judas betraying him. And so there's really close similarities here. David going through the Kidron Valley, burdened with sorrow because he had been betrayed by Absalom, and then you have Jesus passing through the Kidron Valley with an emotional turmoil for what he's about to endure, but also being betrayed by someone, being betrayed by one of his own apostles. And so there's a lot of similarities here in that. But there's even more to the Kidron Valley than just these two stories. There was things that happened in between these. The Kidron Valley was a pretty significant place in the Old Testament. It might be one that's kind of overlooked because it's just mentioned here and there. But the times that it is mentioned, some very important things happened there. It was a place of where they destroyed idols a lot of times. With Asa in 1 Kings chapter 15 and verse 13, Asa destroyed his mother's idols in the Kidron Valley. Josiah destroyed idols in 2 Kings chapter 23 and verse 6. And so it was a place that they would take these idols and crush them to powder, destroy them, do away with them, and that's what it was used for. It was also used for cleansing the temple in the days of Hezekiah, and you can reference 2 Chronicles 29:16 and also chapter 30 and verse 14. They basically took everything that was unclean out of the temple, took it and dumped it into the Kidron Valley. And then also in the time of Josiah, at least in the time of Josiah, it was used as a burial place for the common people. You can refer to 2 Kings chapter 23 and verse 6 for information about that. And so the steep slopes and everything made a good place to making caves and burial places, and that's where they would bury a lot of the people. And so when we step back and get a bird's eye view of the picture that we get of the Kidron Valley throughout scriptures, we see that it was a place of sorrow. We see that it was a place of destroying idols. We see that it was a place of cleansing, and it was a place of burial. And this becomes significant, especially when we begin to apply this Kidron Valley to our own lives and our own situations that we get into from time to time. I think the Kidron Valley, ultimately above it all, represents a valley of sorrow. And the reason I say that is because the story of David here at the Kidron Valley and then the story of Jesus at the Kidron Valley are like the bookends of the stories connected to the Kidron Valley. The first time it's mentioned is with David and his sorrow, and the last time it's mentioned is with Jesus and his sorrow. And so the Kidron Valley can represent for us times of sorrow, times not of just sorrow, but also of emotional turmoil, anxiety, anguish of mind. When we enter into places like that in our lives, it's as though we are entering into the Kidron Valley. Not physically going there, but emotionally, maybe even spiritually, we are in the Kidron Valley. We're in the low places in life. We're in the dark places of life. And I don't think I have to give really a list of examples of times that we might be in the Kidron Valley. We just know. It's those times where our hearts are just languishing. Our minds are just filled with maybe anxious thoughts or whatever it is. We're just in a dark place. And sometimes God allows us to go through the Kidron Valley in this way. But there are some benefits to the Kidron Valley. Even though it can be seen negatively through the emotional, mental, spiritual things that might go on there, it can also be seen as a positive thing, because when we enter into those places, that's a time in which our idols become destroyed, right? All the things that we hoped for, all the things that we enjoyed, all the things that were a big deal to us. Maybe we were so focused on our house or on our cars or making money. Maybe we were real big into entertainment. Maybe we were all about our hobbies. When you hit a hard time, when you hit a hard place, when something happens in your life that takes your breath away, all that stuff becomes nothing. Suddenly your house is not that big of a deal. Suddenly your car, who cares? You don't even want to do your hobbies anymore. When you hit those dark places in life, it has a way of stripping you of idols, and it really gets you down to the bare essentials of life, the core parts of you. It strips away all that excess. But it also has a cleansing effect as well, as the Kidron Valley was used as a place to dump all the stuff that was unclean from the temple as a way of cleansing the temple. So do trials have a way of cleansing us as well. We could refer to 1 Peter chapter 4 verses 1 and 2 that talks about the cleansing effect of trials. Let's turn there real quick. Again, this is 1 Peter chapter 4 verses 1 through 2, where it says, "Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because he who has suffered in his body is done with sin." He who has suffered in his body is done with sin. As a result, he does not live the rest of his earthly life for human desires, but rather for the will of God. It has this purifying effect. When you go through sufferings and trials, you're no longer concerned about getting into all these pleasures, earthly pleasures and sin and stuff like that. You're going through a hardship. You're burdened. And you're casting your cares and your anxieties on the Lord. And you're seeking out the Lord's will. That is, if you're going through it in the proper way. And it's interesting that in both of the stories with Jesus and David, this passing through the Kidron Valley left them to basically resolve to give themselves over to the Lord's will. In chapter 15 and verse 25, this is what David says. He says, "Then the king said to Zadok, take the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again. But if he says, I am not pleased with you, then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him." So David had basically given himself over to the Father's will. And then when you reference Jesus, when he makes it into the Mount of Olives and the Gethsemane and he's praying, remember he says, "Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done." So both of these had passed through the Kidron Valley and had, after they had gone through that, had resolved to let the Lord take over and let God's will be done. And that's similar to what we read here in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 2. That those who go through sufferings, they are purified from sin, but also they no longer live for earthly desires, but to do the will of God. And so, even though the Kidron Valley is not a very pleasant place to go, those dark nights of the soul that we enter into, yet they do bear good things into our lives and can sometimes help us to refocus, to strip away all the excess, and to wholly center ourselves upon God once again. So I don't know if you're going through the Kidron Valley right now, or if the Kidron Valley awaits you in the future, or if you've been in the Kidron Valley in the past. In either case, we need to be mindful of David and Jesus, who passed through that season of sorrow, and remember that there is another side. There is another side. There is another side to it. Things got better for David. Jesus, yes, he was crucified, but then he was resurrected and ascended to the right hand of the Father. And so we have a lot of things to look forward to on the other side. We just got to get through it. Hopefully this is encouraging to you. I thank you guys for watching the video. I love you guys. Hope you have a great day. God bless.